Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History, and you definitely see the title. And yes, I am comparing the term Afro Latino to the one drop rule. And before I even get there, first, I feel like it's important to explain what Afro Latino is, or what I thought Afro Latino was. So, when I first heard the term, I thought it was Black people who were Latino. I thought it was for monoracial, unambiguous, undeniably Black people who happen to be Latin American or have Latin American descent. So that's what I thought it was. Um, but as the years went on, and the more I did research about it, and the more that the term just became a part of the cultural zeitgeist, that really wasn't what it turned out to be. And it's apparently used for Latinos who are of African descent. Okay, this is where things kind of get muddied because of African descent. Is there a limit on this? Should it be people of majority African descent? That's not even the term that they use. That's not the standard that they set it by. Is it for people who are overwhelmingly or mostly African descent? Apparently not. Um, Is it for people who have one drop of African ancestry? Because if that's the case, almost every Latino would be that, but that's not the case. No one knows the amount of African descent you need to be included as an Afro Latino. And that's where things kind of get muddied, and I look at the term sideways. But I think we need to go over the historical context of the actual term. Okay, so just from the little research that I did when it comes to the origins and evolution of the term Afro-Latino, it kind of started in the 1970s, where it first appeared on the Merriam-Webster Dictionary in 1974, describing Latin American or US-based people of African descent and Latin heritage. And they did this to acknowledge the racial marginalization of Afro-Latinos and to also affirm their heritage and to contest pervasive anti-Black attitudes within Latin communities. So there's a lot of anti-racist movement and academic acknowledgement and adoption within the mid to late 20th centuries, where a lot of intellectuals and activists in places like Cuba, Mexico, and Brazil were starting to use Afro hyphen in a lot of their Afro the, the Afro-Latino diasporic advocacy when it comes to like Afro-Cuban, Afro-Mexican, Afro-Brazilian stuff like that. And this became a growing movement in the early 1990s, and the term Afro-Latino gained a lot of traction within the US academic and activist circles. It, of course, emphasized the diversity within Latin America and to confront the erasure of Blackness within that. So this continued within the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, where it became more centered in public outside of academia. So the public discourse was highlighting the intersectional realities of being Black, Latino, being undocumented, and facing huge discrimination, with institutions like NACLA, Pew Research Center, and universities began to publish a lot of works based on the specific demographic. So the identity awareness and cultural assertion grew within the 2010s, where about a quarter of US Latinos self-identified as Afro-Latino, Afro-Caribbean, or African descent from Latin America, highlighting a growing sense of identity specific to Afro-Latin heritage. Though, what's very interesting and kind of contradictory about this whole term is that very few of these self identifying Afro Latinos mark Black on racial questions, where many chose white, Hispanic, or other categories. So, this to me just shows the huge white worship in Latin America and the anti Blackness in Latin America, even amongst some of the Black Latinos, or a lot of these Afro Latinos aren't Black to begin with, and they know this. So that's pretty much what I have when it comes to the basic identity of it, or the basic definition of it, as it's both a linguistic and a political term rooted in early Afro-diasporic movements in Latin America, entering the U.S. discourse in the 1970s and solidifying the academic, activist, and cultural channel since the 1990s up until today. So, when it comes to the term, it was never consistently used with the intention of applying it only to unambiguously black Latinos, though obviously they would suffer the most from erasure in Latin America. So just right off the jump, it was always kind of contradictory. When it comes to the early academic and activist usage, so from the 1960s to the 1980s, when it comes to the Afro-descendant intellectuals and activists in both Latin America and the US using the terms Afro-Cubano, Afro-Brasileiro, and eventually Afro-Latina, the intent was to connect African ancestry to Latinidad, not only to those who look unambiguously black. So it didn't matter how African you were or how black you were, any sort of connection was enough to do it to Latinidad. And I'm wondering if they intentionally did this because they knew the more mixed ones would have a bigger chance of being more visible in Latin America. So, in Brazil, the term was used to describe African descended cultural contributions broadly, mainly focusing on music, religion, and history, not really phenotype. And in the US, the activists in the 1970s and the 1980s used Afro Latina to highlight the erasure of African ancestry in the Hispanic label, focusing on heritage and history as much as appearance. Though, like I mentioned, the unambiguously black ones would be the most invisible ones. So, the second point when it comes to how this term is used, I want to bring up is unambiguous blackness versus mixed slash intermediate appearances. So, some scholars, communities, and people do make the difference and the distinguishness between Afro Latinos, i.e., those who are read socially and phenotypically as black, and Latinos who do acknowledge African ancestry but do not have the experience of racialization as black. So essentially, they ain't black, despite them having some of that ancestry. So when it comes to the Pew Research Center in 2016, they did a study where about 24% of the US Latinos identified as Afro-Latina, but only 18% of those identified as black. So initially, I thought this was 18% out of the, sorry, I thought it meant out of the 24% overall, 18% of that 24, so most of the people identified as black. But no, that's not what it is. So we're going to turn that 24% who identified as Afro-Latino. That is, we're going to change that to the 100% sample. So we're solely focusing on that 24, so it would be 100 now. 18% of those people who identified as Afro-Latino identified as black. So if I were to do the math, 18% out of 100. Yeah, I'm not even gonna bother to do the math. It's extremely low. So most of these quote unquote Afro Latinos do not identify as black because one, they know they're not black. Two, if they are black, they're self-hating black people who want to distance themselves from it. Three, many of them choose white, which just continues the white worshipping that Latinos have, though some of them deny it based on convenience, and some of them do check some other race, which tends to be growing amongst Latinos, I will give them that. Overall, it shows that the term Afro-Latina is used by both unambiguous black Latinos and mixed-looking slash light Latinos who claim African descent. So, another scholar named Miriam Jimenez Roman emphasized that the Afro-Latinidad label was about the recognition of African ancestry and its social consequences. This essentially means that while the heritage element is key, the lived experience of being black also matters. So, the third point that I want to focus on is the tension over who quote unquote counts as an Afro Latino and who doesn't. Because of colorism and mestiçage ideology, there's been a lot of debate over who the label fits and who should count under it. and whether it should be reserved for visibly, emphasis on visibly, Black Latinos or open to all with African roots. So, when it comes to restricting it to unambiguous Blackness, some activists argue that the term should center those who are racialized as Black in societies, because otherwise, lighter Latinos with distant, emphasis on distant, ancestry will claim the identity without facing anti Blackness. And you definitely see this when you look at who are the faces of the Afro Latino label. Some of these people who claim Afro Latino don't even have a parent or a grandparent or a great grandparent who are Black. They don't even look mixed. Some of them are literally like white Latinos or white leaning Latinos who use the label because it sounds cool or they want the culture that is associated with Black Latinos. So, also, the unambiguously Black Latinos are the most invisible Latinos due to the white worshipping, white supremacist mentality and pathology. So when it comes to for inclusivity, others emphasize that African ancestry and cultural heritage, arguing that Afro-Latina identity is about affirming African contribution to Latin America broadly, regardless of phenotype. So pretty much they're trying to one-drop rule this stuff, and I'm going to focus on why I put the two ideologies together. But some believe that even the mixed ones who look like they have African phenotypical traits, they will suffer from racism when it comes to white or mestizo Latinos, and in some areas that is definitely true. And now I'm going to focus on the current understanding of the term. So today, the dominant scholarly activist trend is Afro Latino equals an umbrella term that is for Latin America and specifically US Latinos with African ancestry, but the left experience varies based on appearance, class, and national context. So while some still use it to mean only unambiguous Black Latinos, most academics, activists, and survey recognize it includes a spectrum of Blackness from dark-skinned and phenotypically African to mixed/light Latinos who acknowledge African descent. And you notice how they don't really do this for white Latinos, interestingly enough. So before I move on to anything else, I have to make the not the distinction, but I have to make it clear that the term Afro-Latino is largely a US-centered identity category where most Latin Americans in Latin America either don't use it often or they outright reject the term since they have their own terms or they think that it's the US racial binary trying to be pushed on to them. And a lot of people in Latin America don't identify with the term Latino to begin with, to describe all of them, because there are so many races within Latin America. Each Latin American country has their own history, and they have their own racial categories done differently from one another. And they all have their different mixtures. So when it comes to the United States context, Afro-Latino emerged in the 1970s to 1990s, especially among scholars and activists to affirm African ancestry within Latino identity and fights the erasure of Blackness and Latinidad. And it also responds to the US's racial binary system, which is black/white, where Latinos are pressured to choose. Historically, they really weren't pressured to choose. They actively chose to identify as white. There's a point in time where Mexicans specifically had their own category in the sentence. They outright rejected it and demanded to be labeled white, and they were given that. So I don't think they were forced to choose, especially historically. Anyways, Afro Latino offers a way to assert both Latin and Black identities simultaneously. And I already discussed how 24% of Latinos identify as Afro Latino, though most of them don't identify as Black. So I also want to get into why Latin Americans often reject the term Afro Latino. And it's mainly because they see it as a US import tied to the American racial politics and their structure rather than these Latin American countries' own national histories. Also, they also have ideologies like mestizaje, which is racial mixing, And that actively discouraged explicit black labels in favor of quote unquote mixed categories, though a lot of those quote unquote mixed categories and that pathology was used so they could help whiten their race or their family lineages within the future generations. So a term like Afro Latino feels unnecessary, foreign, and divisive. In contrast, diasporic communities in the US embrace Afro Latino as a way to navigate America's strict racial binary and to demand recognition within Latino communities and spaces that heavily center whiteness. Now I want to talk about how the Afro Latino term didn't really execute its original goal when it comes to counteracting the invisibility of Black people or people of predominantly Black African descent in the Latin American zeitgeist. And it's crazy because the term Afro Latino was coined to fight the invisibility of Black Latinos, yet it often pushed people into that term that are either lighter skinned, i.e., Pardo, Mulatto, Indio, Mestizo, pretty much just three ways of stating mixed race, rather than unambiguously Black people. And people did pick up on the contradiction. So, the original purpose and visibility for our Black Latinos, let's get into that. So, the entire reason scholars and activists in the US popularized the term to begin with was to name and center Blackness within Latinidad, which mainstream Latino narratives erased by centering whiteness or mestizaje. So, pretty much, they wanted to focus on the African contributions to Latin America and the culture and to acknowledge that Black people who are Latino do exist. Though some do mention that the Afro Latino identity does confront the invisibility of Black Latinos in the US racial discourse. So, emphasis on the US and not Latin America, which is an issue with a lot of Latin Americans to begin with. So, NACLA also stresses that the term was meant to make Black Latinos visible both to Latinos and to African Americans who might not recognize them within the Black diaspora. Okay, so I found that part to be kind of interesting because there aren't just African Americans in the Black diaspora, but I think because this is in the US and it's looking in that perspective, obviously African Americans are the most populous Black people in the US. So I guess in that way it makes sense. So, number two is acknowledging why lighter quote unquote Afro Latinos get visibility. So, one reason for this is colorism and anti Blackness. Latin America and the US Latino cultures carry long histories of color hierarchies where lighter skinned people are seen as more representative or marketable. We're going to get more into that later. And Afro Latina that in the US, it's been acknowledged by some people that it has been shaped by Blackimiento, which is essentially whitening, where mulatto and mestizo images are favored while darker Black Latinos remain marginalized. Though I don't know why mestizos are being put into Afro Latinidad when mestizos are people who are roughly half indigenous, Amerindian, and half white Spaniard. So I don't know why they're even in the picture to begin with. Unless the one drop rule, which we're going to get into a bit later. B. Media representation bias. Black Puerto Rican scholars note that when the US media highlights Afro Latinos, the faces shown are often light skinned celebrities, so the likes of a Cardi B or a Gina Torres. This produces the erasure of unambiguously Black Latinos who inspired the category to begin with. And a 2019 study on Afro Latino media visibility found that Afro Latino often becomes shorthand for mixed or ambiguous Latinos, leaving darker Black Latinos invisible yet again. C. Diaspora marketing and diversity light. So, US cultural industries, even academia, often prefer quote unquote digestible Blackness. Essentially, Eurocentric mixed people who signal African ancestry but aren't too Black in appearance. And the Afro Latino visibility often celebrates hybridity, i.e., mulatto and mestizo. Yet again, I don't know why mestizos in the picture to begin with, while minimizing those who experience full black radicalization. The third point is the irony of it re-invisibilizing black, unambiguously black Latinos. So this meant that the original intent flipped on itself, where it was intended to center unambiguously black Latinos who are erased in both Latino and African American contexts. But the outcome is that the visibility often goes to lighter skinned or mixed figures who already had some cultural space to begin with. Though, apparently, some people criticized this because it was claiming that Afro-Latina dad risks becoming another mestizo narrative that romanticizes mixture while sidestepping anti-black racism, which I don't know what else to say about that. And the fourth point, why does it persist? So one of the reasons is institutional preference. So in schools, media, and brands overall, they all tend to tokenize lighter Afro-Latinos as quote unquote proof of diversity. So I'm taking this as this is their way to say that they have diversity while also centering whiteness and not scaring whiteness, whether it's white Latinos or Anglo whites or non-Latino whites. Pretty much. So tokenized diversity in the more acceptable quote unquote blacks. Also, ambiguous identity politics plays into it, where many Afro Latinos with mixed ancestry experience some racial marginalization, but not the full erasure of darker peers. And this is what annoys me. A lot of their racial marginalization has to do with the fact that they are mixed race. So, black people, whether they're black Latinos or black non Latinos, cannot relate to their discrimination because they're not mixed race like that. And mixed race people do not understand the racialization and the discrimination that monoracial black people deal with. Their stories circulate more because they're seen as relatable to both black and Latino spaces, where there's a lot of colorism within black spaces that's akin to the one drop rule, which we're going to get there. And in Latino spaces, it's widely known that the lighter and whiter you are, the better. And it persists because of the centuries long tendency to erase Afro Latin America's darkest populations. So, communities like the Garifuna, Palenqueros, or Afro Mexicans are less known, less represented, and often structurally excluded, even when Afro Latinos is in the spotlight. I'm finally getting to the title of comparing the Afro Latino label to the one drop wall. But I really want to get into the pathology of both Latin America and the United States to eventually get to the comparison where pretty much, Latin America generally rejects the US one drop rule, which pretty much stated that anyone with black ancestry is black. But in practice, something structurally similar can happen when mixed race Latinos with distant African ancestry claim Afro Latino, even if society doesn't racialize them as black. So you see the start of that comparison here. So let's break this down into a few points. So, one, the Latin American context is the mestizaje versus the one drop rule. So, the mestizaje ideology, which is essentially racial mixing, was promoted all across Latin America in the 19th to 20th centuries as a nation building project. Nation building project. It celebrated mixture while erasing black and indigenous identities under the claim that we are all mixed. That's nice and all, but what generally happened was families would tell their offspring to get with people who are lighter, i.e., whiter than them, so they can improve their race. And they did this generation after generation after generation, so they could whiten their lineage. And this is still happening today. And right when this was happening, a lot of these Latin American countries heavily encouraged European immigration. So a lot of Europeans would migrate to these Latin American countries and they would help whiten the countries. So the official story is no one's purely black or white, so there's no need for a one drop rule. But the overall effect of this was blackness got diluted into mulatto, mestizo, indio, etc. categories, making unambiguous blackness invisible. And that was the whole point. And Latin America has been doing this for centuries. So the Afro-Latino label that would come from mestizaje would be another way that they did this. So the second point that I want to get into is the United States context. So Afro-Latino as quote-unquote one-drop light. So in the US, remember, Afro-Latino is mainly a US terminology. Afro-Latino emerged as a way to say Latinos can be black too. It was supposed to, emphasis on supposed to, center those racialized as black. But in practice and in execution, many Latinos who are phenotypically mestizo or white passing claim the label because of distant African ancestry. So notice that it says mestizo or white. This doesn't even include mulattoes, who are those that are mixed heavily or half with black ancestry and half with white ancestry. So the thing with Latin America is that most groups, no matter what they are a mix of three things: indigenous Amerindian, white Spaniard, though it could be other things, mainly white Spaniard, and black West or Central African. Some places are overwhelmingly white with maybe a drop of the other two. Others are overwhelmingly indigenous Amerindia with maybe a drop of the other two. And some are overwhelmingly black with a drop of the other two. Or some are mainly two of these, so mestizo, some are mainly half indigenous, half European, and a drop of black. Some are mulatto, which are like half black, half white, and a drop of Amerindian. And some are an even split of all three. So with the sentence of phenotypically mestizo or white passing, this is the key ideology and the center point of the one-drop rule being emphasized into the Afro-Latino label, where if mestizo and white Latinos are claiming Afro-Latino due to the one distant drop of like ancestry where they don't even know this person or they don't even have any sort of phenotypical relation to it, that's the prime example of the one-drop rule, but in Afro-Latino context. So I already discussed the 2016 study where out of the 24% of the US Latinos that self-identified as Afro-Latino, 18% of that group, so it's not 18 out of 100, but it's 18 out of that already small 24% identify as Black. Why does this recreate invisibility? I want to get to this third point. So, unambiguous Black Latinos, so the dark-skinned Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Colombians, Garifuna, etc., remain underrepresented in media and politics. Meanwhile, lighter Latinos with minimal or distant African ancestry can claim Afro-Latino and receive visibility, which reproduces the same Black erasure the term was originally meant to fight. So essentially, Afro-Latinidad is another mestizaje narrative where the mixture is celebrated, but actual blackness is sidelined, if not overall ignored. And if a monoracial black person claims that they are Afro-Latino, someone will say, "Oh, you're not Latino because you're black." So you see the issue there. So the fourth point is the one-drop irony. So with the US one-drop rule, any black ancestry makes you black, regardless of your appearance or phenotype. So you can be a literal white person, but because you had a great grandparent who was black, you're black. The Afro-Latino drift. Any African ancestry lets you claim Afro-Latino, regardless of appearance. Latin America officially denies the US model, but the way Latin Latinos claim Afro-Latinidad throughout heritage rather than race and phenotype create a mirror image dynamic. And it's essentially ethno-racial fraud, where people claim marginalized Afro-descendant categories without the social experience of Blackness. So now that I started to make somewhat of a comparison between the one drop rule and the Afro Latino label, now it's time for me to break it down even further. And here are some ways that they are similar. One is that they are both based on broad inclusion through ancestry rather than phenotype. So with the one drop rule in the US, any black ancestry, no matter how distant, legally or socially define someone as black, where on the Afro-Latino label, many who identify or are identified as Afro-Latino do so because of African ancestry. Most of the time, it's distant African ancestry, even if their phenotype is mixed or ambiguous, and not necessarily because they are socially read as Black. So both frameworks prioritize ancestry over visible phenotype. The second similarity is the expansion of Blackness beyond the visibly Black. So with the one-drop rule, it expanded Blackness to include mixed-race people who might otherwise have passed as white, or they're literally white people, but they're just one-drop rulers, or non-Black people who were essentially forced to be Black, even if they look nothing like Black people, even if they know no one that was Black, or all that jazz. With the Afro-Latino label, it also expands Blackness to include Latinos who are either mulatto slash pardo slash mestizo, rather than exclusively those with unambiguous African features. Heck, sometimes even white Latinos with a drop of African ancestry will conveniently claim Afro-Latino. So the similarity is in both cases, the category of Blackness gets broadened in ways that sometimes obscure the specific experiences of visibly Black people. The third similarity between them is the ambiguity and tension over identity. So, with the one drop rule, it created conflict for mixed race people who are socially or legally Black, regardless of self identification or their phenotype, especially with how they dealt with Black people. With Afro Latinos, it creates the tension because many who check the label are not seen as Black in Latin America and sometimes in the US, yet are grouped under the Afro Latino label, and a lot of them don't really identify as Black either, and actual Black Latinos are made invisible due to this. So the similarity is that both systems create identity conflicts by imposing a broader racial designation that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. The fourth similarity is the paradox of visibility versus invisibility. So with the one drop rule, it made Black ancestry hyper visible. Hence, any quote unquote drop defines you as Black. But it also erased distinctions and distinctiveness within Blackness overall. With Afro Latinos, it created visibility for Black Latinos in the US discourse, but paradoxically often centers lighter slash mixed Afro descendants, keeping unambiguous Black Latinos marginalized. So the similarity is that both heighten awareness of ancestry while erasing nuance and internal diversity. The fifth and final similarity is that they're both US-centric impositions. So with the one-drop rule, it was a uniquely US racial construct in the 20th century, kind of the late, yeah, it was mainly the 20th century, not mirrored in Latin America's casta slash mestizaje systems, while the Afro-Latino label is also heavily US driven, where many Latin Americans reject it or are very unfamiliar with it, since Latin American categories also rely more on phenotype, class, and context. So the overall similarity with this is that both arise from the US racial frameworks that are different from Latin American systems. So, in short, the Afro-Latino label, like the one-drop rule, extends Blackness through ancestry rather than appearance, sometimes diluting focus on visibly Black people and reflects a US-centric racial lens that doesn't map neatly onto Latin American identity systems. Now it is time to get into the differences between the Afro-Latino label and the one-drop rule, because I don't want to make the claim that they are the exact same. So, the first difference is the purpose and origin. So, with the one-drop rule, it was created under the US white supremacy to police racial boundaries, exclude Black people from whiteness, exclude mixed people from whiteness because white people would get with Black people and produce offspring, and to enforce segregation. With the Afro-Latino label, it emerged more recently as a pan-ethnic identity category in the US to acknowledge African heritage within Latindad, often tied to visibility, activism, and cultural pride. The second difference is agency versus coercion. Where the one-drop rule was strictly imposed by law and custom, individuals had little to no choice in how they were classified, where the Afro-Latino label is often chosen strategically or chosen to be strategically used by individuals or communities to highlight Blackness, though it can still be externally empowered in US context. So, the third difference is the consequences of classification, where the one drop rule was being labeled black meant systematic oppression, i.e., segregation, disenfranchisement, violence, lack of financial opportunities, lack of employment, so on and so forth, where the Afro Latino label had identifying as that can carry empowerment, solidarity, or visibility, though it also risks the tokenization or flattening of said differences. The fourth difference is the flexibility of the category, where the one drop rule is rigid and binary, where you are either black or white, there's absolutely no in between. While with the Afro Latino label, it's fluid and multi-layered, where someone can be Afro Latina and also indigenous, mestizo, or identifying differently depending on the context, which is very loose in my opinion. The fifth reason is the geographic slash cultural context, where the one drop rule was unique to the US and was rooted in slavery and the Jim Crow, where the Afro Latino label is a transnational identity that's tied to both Latin American histories of mestizaje and the US racial politics. Alrighty, so that concludes my video where I kind of equate the Afro-Latino label to the one-drop rule method. I pointed out a lot of the similarities, but I also wanted to make some differences because I didn't want them to be seen as the exact same thing. This is just my opinion as an outsider, and I wanted to give my commentary on this because I genuinely felt like it. Thank you all for watching this, and I'll be back with more content in somewhat of a similar vein. I generally talk about things within the Black race, mainly Caribbean focused, but I'm probably going to extend to other stuff sooner or later. But anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more content soon. Bye!